So may I now request the next panel to come on stage. So we have my dear friend Chaya Bhanti, who is actually going to be moderating the session. Chaya is actually the head of Vertiver. We have Richie Ahuja from EDF, Environmental Defense Fund. Richie is also on the board of the initiative. We have Sri Kumar from Innovations. He's the Innovations Lead at TechnoServe. Aarti Vij, yes, Aarti, from Unis Social Business. Satya Saurabh Khosla. Satyaji. He's an author, writer, thinker, philosopher, and that's how it is. And Shafi. Shafi, who's the brand head, or the chief brand officer of News Republic. So thanks a lot, Shafi, for coming all the way from San Francisco today. Thank you. Thank you.
We may cause social, environmental, and economic collapse, because that's the answer we're looking for. So let me start immediately with something that Sadhviji mentioned earlier, which is a very strong idea and an idea that's very close to my heart. It's the idea of factoring in the true cost of a product. What she said was a price tag of a product doesn't reflect the cost to the soil, to the air, to the health, which is the idea of building in the externalities and the cost of a product truly into when business conducts itself. So my first question is to Richie from the Environmental Defense Fund, which, by the way, the organization has led the way for many decades now on pricing and finding a way to price externalities. Over to you, Richie.
Thanks. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel here, and I'm delighted to see this shared value initiative. I think we're in a very early stage, as Mark and others have mentioned. I'm looking to see where this goes. The big thing here is, I think a few things came up here. It was about shared value is about value creation, it's about cost absorption, it's about reimagining, reframing, it's about, like Nestle talked about, we're becoming a nutrition and health company. So that sort of starts the cycle going in the right direction. So I think you're talking about internalizing an externality. So one of the things that we work on, for example, that I focus on, is climate change. So on the climate change issue, there's a real externality there. It's a major imperative to try and solve this problem. And how do we do this? So can we price carbon is one example to do it. So I think that can put forward a virtuous cycle when you start pricing externalities or environmental externality. So imagine a car company as an example. If you start becoming more from an automotive or an automotive business to a clean mobility business, you can start thinking about how you can price that externality. You can think about how much energy and carbon goes into your machine and how much is emitted as the machine is operated by your customer over time. If you can price it, it's actually a rounding error on the price of the vehicle. But you can start sort of thinking about it as all that pollution now can be managed by sort of putting through an offset program that, for example, in India, could be promoted towards clean cooking. Now, there's a dire need for it. Now, that's just not enough, though. I mean, when you do that, what you do is you offer these options to society at large, but there are a lot of knock-on effects. So you're looking at clean cooking, which has impact on household health, which has impact on population as a whole over time. So there's a lot of interconnected things, and I think we came up and saw that through a lot of these conversations. So I'm looking forward to having a broader conversation on it with you all.
Thank you very much for that. My next question is actually to Shafi Saxena, who, as you guys just heard, flew in all the way from San Francisco to be with us. Shafi comes from a tremendous background in marketing, and she currently is the Chief Brand Officer for News Republic. My question again harkens to something that Sadhviji mentioned earlier in the conversation, which was that we supply to a created demand. We don't really supply the products that the society needs. How do you believe we can shift that? And speak also, please, to your role in the digital space and how that disruption can help create shared value.
That's a lot of questions in one. Let's tackle the marketing question first. I think the way that Sadhvi described marketing is anachronistic, to also use one of Sadhvi's words. I think that's how a lot of the world has been used to operating. We need a radical new vision as to how marketing needs to operate in a new world. We cannot keep operating along the lines that we currently are operating on. We have 7 billion people on the planet. We'll have 10 billion by 2050. It's a non-sustainable model to market and produce in the way that we're currently producing. As Richie just mentioned, we need a radical rethink on metrics. We need to think not just in terms of atomized business metrics, but we need to think in terms of mesh metrics. I do, however, think that the role of marketing is still critical if you redefine how you think of marketing. Marketing is nothing more and nothing less than connecting people with ideas. You can connect people with inspiring ideas and correct actions and desired positive behavior changes, or you can connect them with buying the correct brand of soap. The choice is businesses to make. I also think society as a whole needs to shift from a zero-sum mindset where you operate out of fear and insecurity. What that leads us to do is to acquire and to hoard resources. We need to move from a zero-sum mindset to a non-zero world vision. What that will allow us to do, and I think the technology world has adopted that already, what that will allow us to do is to operate from a place of hope and optimism, which allows us to shed and allows us to share. And as we move from an economy of goods, economy of ideas, this is really easy to do, and that's what the internet has unleashed. I live in Silicon Valley, and I see so many examples of this all around me. Wikipedia took 100 million hours, volunteer hours to create. So what technology and this mindset of an open source world and this mindset of a non-zero model allows us to do is tap into and unlock untapped value. There's a huge cognitive surplus on the planet, and we are not even scratching the surface of that. And that's why events like this are so critical. And actually, that's why I'm here. And I could go on for much longer, but I do want to say, I want to stop now, other than alluding to what Swamiji said earlier in the session today, that you need to think about it. Are we operating in terms of piece, or are we operating in pieces? And I think whether you talk about marketing or manufacturing or technology or supply side or demand side economics, we need to stop operating in a fragmented way and start operating like a beehive. Mesh metrics, that's what we need. And my last thing is Bhutan. Take a look at our neighboring country, Bhutan. They've developed new metrics. They don't just measure gross domestic product, they measure gross national happiness. And businesses and societies need to start to do more of that.
Great. Thanks, Shafi. Aarti, let me ask you a slightly controversial question, since we are within a business setup here. Mohammed Yunus has mentioned frequently that while business is a beautiful mechanism to create self-interest, it isn't really great for collective interest. How does that tie into the work that you're doing at YSB, and how do you believe that ties into the tenets of shared value that we're talking about today?
Thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Professor Yunus talks about the idea of social business. Now, let me explain that a little bit in the context of why we're all here today. If you think about the original purpose of business, the purpose of business is to create value, and then that value then leads to profit. Unfortunately, what has happened is somewhere along the way that order has gotten a little bit mixed up, and what we've ended up doing is creating a system which has a design flaw. And that design flaw is that it puts profit ahead of people. So we are no longer designing businesses for people, for human problems. We are designing businesses for profit. And that, of course, leads to the systemic problems that we see around us today. We have, for example, a banking system which is designed for the rich, as Professor Yunus always says, which excludes 50% of the population. We have a food system where the food producers are so exploited that they are committing suicide. So there is obviously something that has gone wrong. And the problem that is, the reason that this is happening is, again, that we are putting profits ahead of human beings. And it's not that these are two contradictory pieces. Profits will come if you actually genuinely create value for society. And so this design flaw can be corrected only if you have the imagination to see that it is possible to create business models, profitable business models that actually serve society's needs. And that is what Professor Yunus calls the social business. It is a very concentrated form of shared value where you are essentially designing for society's needs. You are designing for those in society that are actually marginalized by the current system of capitalism.
Thank you, Aarti. So I'll quickly segue into a question actually that relates to the work that Shri does. Shri works on a very interesting project. He's the chief of party of a project that works across Africa and India, where in Africa their team identifies the problem statements, and his team in India actually responds to those problem statements by identifying the innovations. So how does the framework of social enterprise factor into the work that you're doing, and how does this kind of value chain across continents work to create this shared value?
Thanks, Chaya. I think very quickly, that particular engagement is the largest of a couple of engagements that TechnoServe and I are involved in at the moment. And that particular engagement is funded by USAID. So at the start, I will say that is donor funded, and the funding is coming from a non-commercial source. And a thank you to all the Americans here whose taxes are helping to pay for that piece of work. However, in answer to your question, one of the key challenges that this project is enabling us to identify is that Africa actually has water resource challenges which India has actually been grappling with longer than Africa has, and that's partly for poor reasons. That's partly because we in India have made pump sets too cheap, too inexpensive, and the electricity to run those agricultural pump sets is free, and therefore we have exploited the groundwater in India far too much. But we've realized that, and there are some communities, particularly in your home state of Rajasthan, Chaya, where traditional techniques of water conservation, capture, rainwater reuse are being very effectively deployed. We're able to find ways that those techniques can be reused in Africa, and those innovations and interventions are addressing water shortage and, in the medium to long term, climate change needs. And through the mechanism of addressing water, we are addressing the water shortage, we are addressing one of the largest environmental and social challenges that the globe is faced with today. So I think there's a very clear connection to the environmental and social components of shared value, even though the funding is not yet commercial. Our medium-term objective would be to essentially catalyze interventions which will attract commercial funding and bring the incentives for pursuing commercial objectives, social objectives, and environmental objectives into a synergistic whole.
So, Mr. Khosla, you predicted the recession way back in 2007. You've been an economist and you're coming from a deep thinking into how ancient wisdom applies to management theory. One of the questions that was raised by the audience earlier today was that the investment community pushes business to give them short-term returns. Now, that is in itself detrimental to the idea of shared value if you're not being able to actually create a long-term vision in how you're investing. So can you speak a little bit to how ancient wisdom and management theory in the space in which you've been working applies to that idea, and how we can prevent the investment community from having such a short-sighted kind of a view?
There are two things that this panel is considering. One is the possibility of a social, economic, and environmental collapse, and the second is the idea of shared value. How can this idea prevent economic, social, and environmental collapse? Let me quickly recapitulate what is shared value and how we can use it. Will come later. Shared value is based on three things. One is reimagining products and markets. Second, enhancing productivity down the value chain. Third, enabling clusters. Broadly speaking, what is this? This is thinking differently. Only if you think differently will you think that there is, how can I empower society? How can I use resources and build clusters? So thinking differently leads to acting differently, and in between comes our idea of strategy. How do you think work and act differently. The way society is today, there is obviously a need for some change because of so many social problems, because of so many economic problems. It means that somewhere we have gone wrong. Shared value is trying to figure out where we have gone wrong. So there is a need for what Porter says a new strategy. Now where does ancient wisdom come into this? Ancient wisdom comes into this because thousands of years ago we discovered that strategy, and we will try to apply it to shared value idea today. What is strategy? Strategy is a way of achieving a goal. So what did ancient Indian wisdom do? It gave 4 goals of life. The way of achieving those goals of life becomes a strategy for living life. When this strategy of living life is applied to work, to our daily activities, business flows out of this strategy. So first of all, it removes the conflict between what I think and what I do. So once the conflict between what I think and what I do is removed, the conflict between man and what he does is removed. There is no conflict between man and society. When there is no conflict between man and society, there is no conflict between society and nature. That was the holistic model of development. What were these 4 goals of life? We call them Purusharthas. You can use any label. I can give you management labels which fit in Porter's and other thinkers' terminology for it, but that is secondary. What are these? As important as Purusharthas is the idea of interdependence of Purusharthas. Which one is to be paired with which one? And where does business fit into it? That becomes the question. Business, as we popularly understand, comes from Artha, the second Purushartha, though that is not the full meaning of Artha. The full meaning of Artha is much deeper. But let us take it at that level and say, Artha, what does it have to be paired with? Artha is only relevant if it is paired with Dharma. So if the strategy for Artha is to be made, if strategy for business is to be made, then shared value has to be Dharma. So until our idea of understanding what is Dharma is there, we will not have a shared value, we will neither have a good strategy and neither will we be able to prevent problems. The problems in society come because of wrong pairing of the Purusharthas. When Kam, which has to be paired with Moksha, is instead paired with Artha, the mixture of Kama and Artha have brought us to this situation. How can this decoupling be done? Once this decoupling is done, the answer to your short-term vision will automatically come.
Richie, you work a lot with agrarian value chains in India, and one of the areas that we work in is actually forestry. And a question that sort of is a predicament for us is something like a community forestry in which it's highly socially profitable,
Right.
but economically it's suboptimal returns, right? You might benefit from the entire value chain, and those are the kind of value chains that you work within. Can you speak to how to actually generate environmental, social, and economic profits at, well, I mean, for lack of a better word, part of the pyramid or those agrarian value chains?
Sure, tough question. I don't have an answer, honestly. So we're testing it out, okay? I think it's it starts with asking the right questions. I mean, like if I'm an agribusiness, and right now, for example, I procure goods from the farmers, I usually don't go to the farmers. I go to the bottleneck. I go to the miller and say, hey, can you give me this? And if I set up a standard and I say, look, I want to procure goods that are of high quality and use less water, I basically ask the miller to give me that as an endorsement. I don't get to the farmer level and measure all the impacts. So there's other ways to then think about it. So, so if you're trying to procure goods and have some transparency, etc., one way to do it would be to say that, look, I'm going to go down and create producer companies that I'm going to own, or co-producer companies, invest in those and work directly with farmers and have that transparency, and then purchase the goods. Or you say, okay, fine, I'm going to help create all these businesses that I want to tap into, so producer companies. I'm going to invest today, and that's your cost. But over the longer term, these producer companies are going to be tied to me, and I'm going to link them right to the markets. And then I'm going to measure exactly all the changes that are going on. So we have, for example, created an IT platform that measures all the water that's being used, how much fertilizer is being used. etc. at the farmer level. So we're using the best of technology. But instead of sort of saying, look, now go ahead and find your market, we're saying, here's a producer company, find the right source in terms of seeds and find the right market. So you suddenly start sort of creating more value, more profitability at that level. And the moment you do that, consumption goes up, local money, sort of churn in the money in the local community goes up. So there's wealth creation right there. There's sort of full transparency and availability for the goods for the buyer. In my case, I mean, in this case, agri-buyer, the company is buying the commodities. There's full transparency to the supplier. So all that stuff sort of starts to fall into place. And we're beginning to see it at some sort of small scale in about 50, 60,000 farmers. The question is, how do we take it to a larger scale? So that's what I'm grappling with.
Shafi, one more question for you. Again, another issue very close to my heart, which is design thinking. You work with Stanford's Design Lab and work on, I think, design for extreme affordability ideas. One of the tenets of shared value is reconceiving products and markets. And I'd love to know about your experience at Stanford in kind of designing these products that are good for society and how that feeds back into this framework and how it can help.
So just to clarify, I don't work for them. I coach. I have coached their innovation for extreme affordability class, and I think some of the work that they're doing is so exciting. It brings forward the principles of mesh thinking that I was talking about. You take in some artists, you take in some business majors, and you take in some engineers, and you give them a problem that seems unsolvable. So for instance, I'll give you one example of a product they created, infant warmers. Infant mortality is a huge problem in emerging markets. But when you get premature births, the warmers used to cost millions and millions of dollars, and most hospitals and homes couldn't afford them. So infant mortality was a massive problem. Now that, if you think in terms of mesh thinking, is not just a problem for the individual mom and dad that lose that child, it's a problem for society, because if the societal mindset is we need to have lots of children because some of our children might die, your population growth rates are higher. So if you solve the infant mortality problem, you actually reduce fertility rates, and it's a positive cycle, it's a virtuous cycle. So what did this team at Stanford do? They took and created something called Embrace, a bunch of students, graduate students, and they did it in 10 weeks. They created an infant warmer that's made out of cloth that a mother, a Nepali woman, it was piloted in Nepal, can use in her home, and the premature mortality deaths plummeted because it was used, it was affordable. GE has just bought it for about $100 million. So when you bring these principles of design thinking, which are really led by two fundamental tenets, one, empathy, two, creativity. You put empathy and creativity together, it unleashes alchemy. It truly does. And I'm going to come back to address a little bit about crafting shared value. One of the things, I'm very inspired by everything that I'm hearing, but one of the things that I'm reacting against is the language of crafting shared value. I think we are setting our aspirations too high. I think the language needs to be higher energy. We need to inspire people and connect people, and that is what will bring about the mindset shift. We're not talking about value. We're not talking about sustainability. We're not talking about words that exist in the stock market reports or business. We're talking about abundance. We're talking about actually creating an incredibly exciting world and vision. And I think if we start to address the language of value and bring some design thinking principles to that, we will get those mindset shifts that we're looking for quicker.
Thanks for that, Shafi. The next question is both for Aarti and for Shri, because you both work in the social enterprise space. Mr. Khaitan had earlier raised a question about how skill development is integral to shared value. Can you both speak about the enterprises within which you work and how skill development is taking place within that space, and whether you are seeking the help of businesses as partners to help you scale those efforts up?
Lady first. So, no.
So we are, maybe can I talk a little more broadly, maybe not about skill development, but about some of the other social businesses that we're focusing on? The reason is that since we're talking about shared value and since we're talking about companies, I'd really like to talk about an example of how a company is embedding this idea of value first, people first into its core business model. We don't really have an example in the skill development space. Yeah? So let me talk a little bit about we have a lot of companies that are now starting to adopt this idea of social business within the Grameen family. We have many joint ventures between Grameen and international companies like Danone, like Veolia, like BASF. In each of these cases, these companies have set up a separate entity, a social business entity. This entity acts as a innovation hub to put value first, to put people first, and to design first for problems that actually exist in society. And in each of these cases, they're using what they know how to do. So, for example, Danone, which is a yogurt company, has created Grameen Danone in Bangladesh. It is a social business that is created with the intention of addressing malnutrition. And so Danone uses what they know how to do, which is make yogurt, they fortify it, and they sell it at a price that is affordable for the poorest possible family. And they're using basically what they know how to do to address a very big problem, malnutrition. Now, through the social business, which has, now one thing that I must explain about social business is that a social business is a non-dividend business. It is created with the specific intention of solving a social problem. And so what you do is you unleash a lot of innovation because you remove the blinkers of profit maximization. So you open yourself up to very, very different ways of doing things, very different products, very different ways of organizing your value chain. And there have been tremendous business benefits as well that have spillovers from that innovation process. Spillovers in terms of the kind of products that they've come up with. They've designed yogurt that now has a longer shelf life because there is no cold chain, regular cold chain in Bangladesh. They've designed direct marketing channels, door-to-door saleswomen, because again, they felt that this was the best way to actually create social value as well. They have designed an innovative cold chain which links marginal farmers that have only 1 or 2 cows and live on islands which are flooded for 3 days in a week with their factory. They have designed, so there are many, many innovations that have come about as a result of designing for society as opposed to designing for profit. And these innovations have spilled over into how they look at their core business as well.
I have one of these. So, well, I'm delighted to talk about that, Chaya, because we've just, in TechnoServe, we've just started in the last year, we've started a couple of initiatives in the areas of skill development, one of which is a very conventional sounding project to bring certain business and communication skills to young people who are graduating from not necessarily the best educational institutions in Mumbai, but in Mumbai have aspirations. So we're delivering a set of training programs that enhance their communication skills, that enhance business etiquette, and some other areas that potential employers have told us are important to them. And the other, which is in a very different market, but I think it's appropriate to bring it up because it's actually it's actually an initiative of one of the partner organizations here, Abbott. And Abbott is actually attempting to bring about a change in the milk supply chain in India, which, as you probably know, is quite unique because of the number of very, very small farmers who are involved. In both these cases, what's common to both these cases essentially is that there is a certain amount of expenditure going into what seems like a largely philanthropic activity, but is in fact delivering some very significant commercial benefits to the organizations that are funding it. And to that point, if I can just take off for a couple of sentences, taking up from what Richie said, and to some extent arguing with what Shafi said. We've all agreed that the metrics that we use need to be overhauled. And I would take that one step further and say that the metrics we use need to be changed completely. The reason why we're not following the inspirational approach that Shafi mentioned and that Richie has mentioned offline is that businesses and their leaders are not yet rewarded on the basis of following their inspiration. They're rewarded on the basis of certain commercial metrics. So we need to find mechanisms that bring the rewards for those social and environmental benefits in line with the commercial benefits. And I think both of these skill development initiatives are progressing in that direction.
You might want to argue. I will not. I agree with you. We need new metrics.
And Richie, you have an example for what he was just talking about, right?
Yeah, I think it's about asking. So here's what happened with us. It's the right question, asking the right questions. Two examples, really quick ones. How many of you all fly Indigo? You know, everybody sort of. I imagine all of you have flown Indigo at some point in time. So there's an option when you book a ticket right now that says, you know, as a passenger, if I'm going to fly, I'm going to offset my emissions for the pollution that I cause. So you pay 200 rupees, you have an option to pay it, and many people do, and it flows to our projects, and we actually help build biogas units at household levels. Now the question was, can we just go ahead and buy those biogas units and airdrop them in? What's the value in that, and who actually keeps the money, and what happens to the money, and how does it flow around? Or can we sort of do skill development on the ground, train the people to build those units that are equally durable and scale that up across the country? What we found was that the second version was better. And you're creating jobs on the ground, there's more money flowing in the same economy, etc. Similarly, right now we are sort of struggling with trying to deliver energy into a Gram Panchayat. So can we create a Gram Panchayat energy company? At the same time, can we also, you know, take the waste heat and create drinking water, 5 liters of drinking water per household per day, per person per day for about 20,000 people, and deliver refrigerated storage. Now that drinking water that's generated, you could turn it into a company, as in I would own it, the person who's investing, or I can say, look, this is being generated, this is my cost, let me see if I can create a company that's owned by the locals to drive this and see what kind of innovation results. So that's kind of, I think, where we need to step in and really start thinking about what questions are we asking, where we are trying to create value. Value is not just value creation for the shareholder, but it's also for the society and the broader community. And really, I mean, like a company is, there's no difference between a company and society. I mean, those, you know, I love that story about being in the boat and 3 lines there. I mean, literally, you're built on the edifice of society, you are society. So ask the right questions and you'll find the right answers. But finding the right questions is really difficult.
Richie, I'd love to take it one step further and say there's no difference anymore between an individual and a company. That's where we're headed down.
Sure.
We've grown up in this local and linear world, and that seems to be the prevailing mindset. We're living in a global and an exponential world. And if you look at places like Norway that has achieved energy independence, or even if you look at some homes in California that have solar panels that are generating surplus electricity that they can feed back to the mesh,
Right.
Those are the new business models that we need to be looking at, and there's so much value to be unlocked.
Yep.
Great, we're almost at the end of the panel, and I cannot let Mr. Khosla get off the hook without telling us if we are headed for another catastrophic recession anytime soon.
I think instead I'll discuss that point which Swamiji raised and which has not been discussed till now. Swamiji, when everyone was talking of skill development and everyone in the panel has talked of skill development, Swamiji raised a different point. Dharma is the skill of living life. It is based on empathy. In the ancient Indian tradition, we first teach that skill. Skills of a trade keep changing. By the time you come out of college, what you've learned has already become irrelevant. So these skills of the trade will keep changing, and you may have to learn 4 or 5 skills in your lifetime. But the ability to learn the skills with efficiency, with excellence, and with goodness is what Dharma is about. It teaches you the skill of empathy, the skill of togetherness, the interlinkage between man and society, that you think of the social problem as your problem. You are not able to see the difference between yourself and the customer. In the words of Gandhi, it would be Vaishnava Jan, tene re kahiye, peed parai jani re. If you are able to feel the pain of the customer as your own customer, as your own pain, that is Dharma.
Okay, great. We conclude with this and off to lunch, guys. Thanks very much, guys. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chaya, for really doing this great panel. Thanks a lot. So we'll just close for lunch now, but before that, can I actually give a small token of appreciation from Leela as a round of golf for whatever.
Golf for environmentalists.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ajvi. Do you play golf?
Thanks, Amit.
I hope you play.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.